I was just going to say how inspirational the work of Algorithm Watch has been for us in terms of thinking about what could constitute possible research programs in this kind of area, and what the work that Minna has described in Finland and more broadly across Europe in mapping ADM, in taking the measure of ADM across that continent, I think sets a really inspiring precedent for us to consider what we might need to do here and the kind of work that we're looking towards in terms of the new centre and other programs. I think that it also, and we had a sense of this in the beginning of your talk, Minna, of some of the really useful ways in which you and Algorithm Watch are thinking about this issue. We can think of them like navigational aids. If we're exploring this unknown territory, how do we go about it? And I think there are some really useful moves that are made in this research, which are very instructive for us. So, first of all, it's striking in that it's taking a technology neutral approach to the problem. So it's not just about AI, it's not just about machine learning, it's not just about deep learning, it's not just about blockchain, it's not just about whatever technology flavour of the moment people are talking about. It's recognising that there are systems and processes at work here which actually have quite a history and quite a future and need to be considered and examined independently of the particular technologies that underpin them. It's also taking what I would call a systemic approach. So we're not just talking about algorithms or big data, terms which have dominated the social science and the emergence of critical work in this space, in the humanities and elsewhere, over the last decade or longer. But we're starting to increasingly see how they're a bit inadequate to describe what we're really dealing with here, especially when we're starting to come to terms with the political and social environments in which these systems are operating. And Algorithm Watch takes those to be integral parts of the automated decision-making systems which it describes. I think that's really useful. It means that we're not just talking about things that are designed by engineers. They're also designed by policymakers and politicians, and all of them need to be accountable for them. Another really instructive, useful point. Minna's engaging with these systems as they are. It's the point we've made about case studies, but concentrating on automation as it is actually going on, rather than as it's been imagined or perceived or projected into a remote future, is actually extraordinarily important and helpful. We're not talking about imaginary systems which don't exist, apart from the digital minds one, maybe. But we're talking about things that are real. There's another element in the Algorithm Watch work which is not prominent in the report, but I think is also significant, and that is that it provides a bit of historical context to all of this, and that made me think a little bit about how we can use this work in Australia, what it might mean for us in terms of going forward. So we've talked a little bit about our new ARC centre, so we love this thing called the ARC. For our Scandinavian colleagues, that's the Australian Research Council, but there used to be something else called the ARC here in Australia, and that was the Administrative Review Council, which existed for a while as a key advisory and policy-making body around administrative law until it met its demise after the election of the coalition government in 2013 and was disbanded. Now, that ARC, the Administrative Review Council, did a lot of work on automated decision-making back in the 2000s, back in the early 2000s. Its first report on the subject came out in 2004. At that time, it was talking about what were then called expert systems. As it went on with that, the language changed, and of course, and it adopted a more sort of technology-neutral approach. As that particular technological approach, the expert systems idea, faded a bit and other systems emerged. But what it did do, it's interesting because it actually attempted what Algorithm Watch has been doing in Europe recently, which is to map these systems across the Australian landscape, and it hasn't been done since. And what they found was an extraordinary profusion of ADM across the Australian government at that time. And they produced a sort of a huge list of these systems. They found them across the entire portfolio of the national government's activities, from welfare payments to customs and border control and immigration, areas of taxation, areas of environmental protection, industry regulation, health and medical provision, aged and social care, going back 15, 20 years, were all areas where automation was well advanced, and also these debates about how they should be regulated and controlled were also well advanced. And so there's a real risk, especially when we get distracted by particular tech, like machine learning or something like that, that we just reinvent this whole wheel and we start again. Whereas in fact, there's been a lot of really useful work that's actually already been done. So back then, these systems were recognised in exactly the way Minna's been talking about. They produced huge benefits. They saved very substantial resources. They were able to do things that humans couldn't do. So just in one area alone, back in the early 2000s, in the Department of Veterans Affairs, where they were working on automated systems for veterans' benefits and payments, they had systems which were helping or making or guiding decisions on the basis of several thousand pages of legislation, and making decisions on the basis of almost 10,000 separate rules. So these were not things that humans could do at the time, and they produced very substantial and significant benefits. So in the light of all of that, what was the Administrative Review Council called for an alignment of these automated systems with what was then a well-established system of public law, critical public law principles: lawfulness, procedural fairness, transparency, efficiency, rationality. And they went beyond that set of principles in 2007 to develop what was called a better practice guide. And here in this phase of that work, you can actually see them engaging, grappling with the problem of training people to design systems that meet these kinds of requirements, exactly the kind of problem that we're addressing now, of how do we engage people across different disciplines and in different professional contexts to work together to produce systems that meet citizens' expectations of fairness and also basic legal requirements. So in that guide, they were carefully elaborating how automated systems needed to interact with humans, how they needed to be humanised, as we would say in the context of this discussion. So emphasising the need to record the reasons for a decision, including the exercise of discretion, the probative weighting of evidence, what particular findings of fact were involved, to allow for human verification, to identify the owners, the institutional and human owners of rules and policies, the holders of delegated authorities to act, and the imperative to build review and evaluation into the design of these automated systems. So that was all the work that was done more than 10 years ago. As I said, that particular ARC no longer disappears. We're lucky to have the one we have, but it's not that one. So what we find now in Australia is that our government, along with governments right around the world, including many in Europe, are developing frameworks for ethics, for artificial intelligence and other things. And they're doing that from lots of different perspectives. We've got a process here in Australia, which I don't know, some of you may have followed, some of you may be involved in it. It's elicited a lot of very productive and stimulating public debate around fairness, around these questions and problems of transparency and accountability and explainability and so forth. And the government is on its way to A discussion paper was prepared by Data 61, part of CSIRO, a technology organisation, and the government is on its way to developing toolkits and guidelines and so forth. But there are huge questions that remain unresolved in this whole process if you've been following it. So one of the ethical principles which everybody agreed they should have, or should be part of this, is fairness. However, there's no agreement about what fairness should be. So we all agree that we should have these ethical principles, but we don't agree on what they should be. And there is no mechanism for achieving that agreement. I would say that the earlier ARC's process actually insisted on something else, which was just lawfulness. Is this system lawful? And so if you look at what's by far the largest fiasco recently in Australian automated decision-making, which is the Robodebt case, the problem, Robodebt's collapsed not because it wasn't ethical, not because it didn't meet this checklist of potential principles or guidelines. It's collapsed because it wasn't lawful, because it was raising debts and switching the onus of proof onto the people who were claimed to have incurred the debts, rather than having the onus of proof on the institution, the organisation which was claiming that that existed. Now, I'm not sure that that wouldn't have happened if the Australian Review Council had continued to exist. I don't think you could argue that, but I think it would have made it a bit more difficult for them to have done it in that way. And I think that particular case is an outstanding example of the need for us to appreciate automated decision-making in the way that Algorithm Watch has done so, taking into account those social and political and economic imperatives that have shaped this system. It's not a technologically sophisticated model at all, but what it did was extraordinarily powerful. So I think this sort of points us in another direction. Jeff Mulgan, among many other people, have raised the question of how effective all these checklists and guidelines of ethical principles for AI actually are. They're all over the world now, and there's a real question about what they've actually achieved. And so far, it's really hard to say whether they've achieved anything. I think that the example of Robodebt and the work that Algorithm Watch has done really points to the critical role of institutions in making sure that these new systems are at very least lawful, at least insofar as we know the law, and there may be many areas where we don't yet know the law. But many of the failings that are identified are purely legal. They're not complicated or contestable ethical ones. They're just legal ones. So I guess my suggestion at the end of this, and I hope I haven't spoken for too long, but I guess my thinking about it is that we get to rehumanising automated decision-making systems in a slightly circuitous route, and we do it by making sure that the institutions that support those processes and that can mitigate risks and that can protect human interests are also strong. So, that's it.
Do you want to make any comments?
What should I say? I really appreciate the fact that you bring this historical perspective, because that's something that I have been kind of wondering about our work, how ahistorical it is. And another thing is that when you start historicizing it, you realize that you're actually dealing with bureaucracy. Like this should be just like, yeah. So business as usual, bureaucracy, we don't necessarily like it, but it works. And that's what these systems should be, part of bureaucratic processes.
This podcast was part of the Re-humanising Automated Decision-Making Seminar, which took place on Thursday the 12th of December 2019. Production was by the Emerging Technologies Research Lab, which is a cross-faculty initiative through Art, Design and Architecture and Information Technology at Monash University. The event was made possible by the Re-humanising Automated Decision-Making Network, which is funded by the Riksbankens Jubileumsfond.